Hi again. I'd like to continue the discussion of Swift. And in the last example, I created a playground, and then I created a couple variables in the playground. I talked about using var to create a mutable variable and using let to create an immutable variable. Okay? So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about types. Okay? So in Swift, every variable has to have a type. In other words, you need to tell the computer what type of information you're putting in that variable. And that variable can only store that kind of information. Let's do an example. So I'm going to create my two variables here like greeting and var, like I did earlier. And I'm going to add another variable here. Let's make this a var because we might want to change the value this time. And let's call this score. And let's say, we're creating a game and we're going to greet the player with, this greeting. And then we're going to use their name every time we greet them. Okay? And maybe the greeting is going to adjust itself depending on what your score is, so we can say like, hey, great job, or wow, you got the high score, or something like that, right? The name isn't going to change though, so we use an immutable variable here, but we use the mutable variable on the greeting because the greeting might change depending on the score. And the score is maybe going to change over time, so, we need to make sure that that's a mutable variable with var, right? Because you might get more points as you play. So let's try that. What if I say score equals, score plus 10 points, okay? And then maybe, just as a note, a little bit of math here, when we do score equals itself plus 10, we're going to, take the current value of 0, add 10 to it, and assign that to the value or assign that to the variable score as the new value, right? We can write this another way too. We can say plus equals 10, and now you can see here now the score is 20, right? And then you can even do this. You can say score plus plus, and that'll add 1. I got an error there. I forgot. In Swift, you can't have a space between the plus plus, and also it shows 20 here. But if I put the plus plus behind or on the right side of score, the value for score is displayed before the number is added. Okay, and that's kind of a subtle thing. We don't need to worry about that today. But if I had placed the plus plus, because you can see here it says 20, but then it's not going to show me that the value's 21 until the next line. If I put the plus plus in front like that, then it's going to show 21 here, right? So anyway, there's a couple ways to add or set the math of score. Maybe let's add some serious points here. Let's do score plus equals 500, right? Okay, so now we have a pretty good score going. So what if we wanted to say like the game was over? Okay, now note that score was assigned a numeric value, okay, when we began. So score has, a number in it. Okay, that's the type of information that it's storing. In this case, it's actually storing a 0, which I think the computer's going to assume is an integer. Okay, and that's a whole number. And then when I add values to it here, these values are all integer values, so that's okay with this type. Okay, so what if down here, what if I said something like score equals, game over? Now, game over is a string, right? It's not a number. And so the computer gives me an error here, and it says type int does not conform to protocol string literal convertible, okay? I know that sounds a little bit of computer speak there, but essentially it's saying that this type is an int, okay? So in other words, it contains an integer type information. It's a number that's a whole number, doesn't have a decimal place. Integer, right? And then it's not allowed to convert to a string. Okay, so that's how types work. You set the type of a value for a variable or something, and that variable always has to hold that type of information. You're not allowed to change it. Okay, let's try another one just for fun here. So let's say I got score of 500, and then I want to add some points here, and I want to say score plus equals 5.75 points. Okay, and here again I get another error because this is a decimal type number. Okay, it's got a decimal place in it. It's not a whole number. It's not an integer. And score is an integer when we officially, defined it up here with the keyword var. Okay, so it gives me an error, and it says int is not identical to uint8. Okay, so it's saying like, hey, you know what? This int type doesn't match this other type here that you're trying to set. Okay, I know those error messages, they're not very helpful to me either, but maybe they should have someone rewrite those in sort of plain English that this designers and artists can understand. But anyway, that's what's going on there. Okay, so you're not allowed to change the type once you've set the type. Okay, let's imagine, just as an experiment here, what if we wanted to set score to 0 when we began, but we really want it to be, this type of 0 with a decimal in it. Okay, and when I put the decimal in there, Swift recognizes that now I'm talking about a decimal value, and so it makes this a decimal value, and now this is okay down here. And this all works too, because these could have just been, something like that, and that's fine, right? And Swift kind of understands, it kind of works with you, and it says, well, like you set this to a decimal value, and 10 is, it can be a decimal value also, right? So it adds that, and it understands what we're talking about, okay? Another way that you can do this is you can put a type here. So if you follow the name of a variable, when you define it with the colon, and then set it to a type like, let's say, float like this, that's a type that has a decimal place, then Swift will be okay with that also. So here I'm saying score is type float, and then it has a starting value of 0. Okay, so there's a quick introduction to variables and types. Okay, and the same thing goes for string up here, just as a note before we're done here. But if I wanted to make sure that Swift knew this was a string, then I could put :string on there. And notice the types always begin with an uppercase letter, okay? Up here, the type, they call this implicit, right? So since you're setting the value of greeting to a string, then Swift implicitly sets the type of greeting to string. And the same thing happened here before we added the float. It implicitly set the value to an integer or the float, when we added the decimal point, okay? So anyway, there's a quick introduction to Swift, variables, and types.